But I think unions have to be honest too about how badly they handled what was going on then, how many of the unions were infiltrated with militant, with socialist workers, with Trotskyites of one kind or another, who managed to capture bits of it that then were the bits that seized the public attention. As often happens with any demonstration you go on now, who's handing out the banners, who's bothered to make them? It's the socialist workers. Most of the people there are not socialist workers. They managed to still play those tricks. And I think everybody's got to get much cleverer about that and make sure that that isn't the image. I mean, they're not really there anymore in the way that they were. But you know, the defeat of Barbara Castle's really quite modest reforms were an absolute calamity and a catastrophe of Callaghan, half of the Labour Party, and the trade unions at the time, who just were so short-sighted. So I don't think you can just sweep it away and say, it was terrible, Mrs. Thatcher, who came along and left us, which is true, with a very, very, as you were saying, a very, very unbalanced, against anti-union laws still that make balance almost impossible, and the balance just tipped a long way the other way. I think the tragedy is that the broken power and influence of the unions really has been a disaster for politics in this country in a really deep and profound way that I don't think has been thoroughly analysed or understood. That the political understanding of a nation that no longer identifies with, comes up from, listens to trade unions, is just so weak. And everything is then much more in the hands of the media or the politicians of the right to describe the country to itself. And I think this has become a country that does no longer know itself. And the image that's presented of itself all the time is a very, very untrue one. It's an image where people believe anybody can make it if they try. They believe in the myths of the sort of X Factor myths of American society, that anyone can. It's even less true in America than it is here, even less true, less true here than in the rest of Europe. But it is the American myth that has replaced trade union understanding of the actual distribution of wealth and opportunity in the country. The research that we did for our book, Unjust Rewards, we looked at people's understanding just of what others earn and where they are on the scales. And people no longer know. In the 1970s, people knew pretty well where they stood, because pay was the daily discourse of news. And you knew what the pay claims were, you knew who got what, you knew what miners got, you knew what just about everybody got, and you knew where you stood. And this is no longer the case. People in the very lowest groups place themselves somewhere near the middle. People right at the top, people in the top 40% earning astronomical things. We did focus groups with them. Imagine that they were somewhere in the sort of top half and were clueless and very shocked. When we asked them to estimate what they thought the median was, or where they thought the 40% tax band kicked in, they were wildly wrong. They thought the poverty level was at about 23,000. And that, of course, was then, a couple of years ago, the median. But the same was true all the way through. It's not just that the rich had disappeared into the stratosphere. The poor also didn't realise how far behind they'd fallen, which I don't think was true in the 1970s. As a result, you had much more pressure towards greater equality in pay. And in 1977, I think, was the peak period for the greatest equality in earnings in this country. It had sort of been a story of coming down steadily since the beginning of the last century, that then shot off again in the 1980s and has continued on upwards to greater and greater inequality. And it's the lack of union voice and power that has really allowed that to happen. Not just through the muscle power of going on strike, but through that political understanding power that is now missing, and people often leaving people living in realms of unreality. A generation that's almost completely ignorant of trade unionism, except tripping over an occasional irritating Bob Crow strike is about all they come across. Even trade union members don't vote in their own elections for their leaders. And goodness knows those elections don't come up all that often. The leaders seem to be there an awful long time, but not many of them vote, and not even voting amongst trade union members who pay the political levy for the leader of the Labour Party, which I find extraordinary that so few can vote. And it really does show the extent to which politics have drained out of trade unionism, and trade unionism drained out of the national bloodstream in a way that has been pretty toxic. I mean, as for, is the press cynical? Well, do the bears and so on. I mean, 80% of our press is owned by 3 or 4 absolutely appalling, maverick, very far right-wing press barons. It's been the case since about the 1930s. It's got much worse since Murdoch's arrival on the scene. He owns over 40% of the press. He owns Sky, which is now about to become mega dominant. It's already got an income much larger than the BBC's. Its investment stage is over. It's now into a huge growth phase. In 10 years' time, it really is going to be by far the dominant broadcaster in a way it hasn't been up until now. Is he going to be allowed to bust the media bias laws? I bet you he is. I bet you the coalition will let him do it. Or he'll just do it and nobody will do much about it. So what do? We say, well, the press should, and I'm always having to address charities and other people who say, why doesn't the press have a better image of A, B, or C, or D, disadvantaged group? Shouldn't they? And they pass motions saying they should. There is no should with the media. It is a ferocious force of nature. Well, it isn't a force of nature because your government could have controlled it quite a bit if you decided to go back to the old media ownership laws before Thatcher broke them. But the battle that you're facing now has to be faced realistically, not just what should the media do, but how do we win the battle to win the public's hearts and minds? And what the trade unions do over that is absolutely crucial. I mean, we're about to enter into a phase of appalling mass cuts, mass sackings in the public sector. If the trade union's reaction to that is to go on strike against the public, I don't think that's going to be very clever. I think if teachers walk out on their kids and if people walk out of hospitals, and it's just got to be sharper and cleverer than that. It's got to use skills of people like you to say, right, what's a really imaginative way of engaging public emotions in the way that your film does? All of these films are always retrospective. You have lovely romantic films about, Billy Elliot and Brassnoff, and go back to Tolkien Martyrs. As long as it's safely in the past, people are engaged. You have to be able to engage some of those emotions with things going on now. And you don't do that by aligning yourself against the public, but with the public. And you have to think of ways of getting service users on your side to be protesting with you against the government. And that means perhaps work-ins, not strikes, Clydeside style. It means thinking of ways in which you should express your passion about the public sector, which nearly all public sector workers do feel passionately about. If it's just about my jobs, my conditions, and I'm going to inconvenience the public on the way, the balance will tip the wrong way. And I don't think I think it's quite easy to be clever in the slogans, in the gestures, and in catching that spirit, because the public are just about to be there. They're just about to realise that the deficit is not the be-all and end-all, and actually their services are valuable, when suddenly all of their classroom assistants have gone. You galvanise those mums with plans at the school gates. You don't make life hell for them by sending their kids home so they can't work. And so the sort of, the kind of Bob Crow against the public view seems to me to be a path to disaster, which would play straight into the government's hands, and I'm sure they'd be thrilled with it. So really, that's all I wanted to say, and I think it's quite easy to get together people who can think creatively, imaginatively, in an artistic way about how you create protests that really capture the hearts of people. And that's what it's about. It's not about muscle. It's about muscle